A few housekeeping matters before we start. First, very importantly, for the benefit of those of you who are earning your credits online and via the simulcast, the all-important code for you to remember today is HT1314. And I'll tell you how I chose that. Make it easy to remember. Human trafficking, of course, HT, and 13 or 14 is the typical age when prostitutes are recruited into that profession. So, that's the first piece of housekeeping. Now, a much more pleasant piece of housekeeping. You see that lovely artwork over there? That, believe it or not, was done by a high school student. And that high school student has been interested and cares about this issue, which to her credit, long before most of us are aware, this young woman is aware of the issue, cares deeply about the issue, so deeply that she did that, which, what talent. And as it happens, her dad, Matt Alperin, is somebody I've known for years, practiced in our courts, and is now with the Office of Indigent Legal Services. Matt, where are you? Yes, you must be very proud of your daughter, and you should be. And now I would also like to ask all of the victims advocates people who are here today to please stand and be recognized. Okay? Victims advocates. Thank you. All right, now we've heard from the judiciary. Now it's time to hear the law enforcement perspective. And again, we have an all-star panel. And one of our stars is missing. I just noticed that. Hopefully he will return shortly. DA Soares will, I'm sure, be here momentarily. But we have Special Agent Jim Spiro of Homeland Security and C.J. Boykin from the Division of Criminal Justice Services. And we have Albany Police Chief Brendan Cox. And shortly we will have, and here he is, District Attorney David Soares. And it really is a wonderful panel. So I will turn it over to, let's see, who shall we start with? Special Agent Spiro, I think I'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Good afternoon, everybody. Am I on? Can the people in the back hear me?
I think we have to keep these mics very close to our.
All right, because I came in this afternoon and was sitting in the back, and some of it was a little hard to hear. So let me know if I start to trail off. Just say a little louder, and I will pipe up. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to attend such an important event. I am James Spiro, and I'm actually the special agent in charge for Homeland Security and Investigations for most of upstate New York. Before I get into my remarks, one thing I would just want to ask is, has anybody in the room, has anyone already worked with Homeland Security Investigations in this area or any other? All right, a couple of our victim advocate folks, glad to see. But not a lot of people in the room. Does anybody in the room know what Homeland Security Investigations is? All right, so I'm glad that I didn't just automatically assume that. All right, so I usually don't. I just want to give a quick brief on what my agency is and what we're trying to accomplish. Homeland Security Investigations is the primary or principal law enforcement, investigative law enforcement agency within the Department of Homeland Security. So HSI is a part of DHS. Now, what our mission, our main mission is to combat transnational criminal organizations who seek to exploit America's legitimate trade, travel, and financial systems. So it's a big mission. We have about 8,400 employees. We're in about 200 cities throughout the country, and we have 62 offices around the globe. And it's that international footprint that really kind of helps us with those transnational criminal organizations. And that's one of the things I just want to remind everybody too, is that this particular area that we're talking about, human trafficking, is both a global issue and a very close to home domestic issue as well. My area of responsibility within HSI, I'm based out of Buffalo. So I'm the special agent in charge in Buffalo, New York. I cover the upper 48 counties of New York, which includes the 450 miles of New York and Canadian border. And I have offices in Buffalo, Syracuse, Messina, Rouse's Point, and right here in Albany. So we've got a big mission, and we have essentially, and what the agency's made up of, I forgot to let you know, is the former U.S. Customs Service agents and the former Immigration and Naturalization Service agents combined to become Immigration Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations. So that's where we get our authority. We're a cross-border agency, and we enforce over 400 statutes and regulations pertaining to federal law enforcement. So it's a big mission. We have some 5 top strategic priorities for FY 2016. They are counterterrorism and homeland security, child exploitation and cyber crimes, human trafficking and human smuggling, narcotics and transnational gangs. And hopefully everybody got one of these reference sheets as a takeaway. These are 4 individual, separate but equal columns, and underneath there's a bottom ribbon for our financial investigations, because every one of these categories that we investigate have a financial component. Essentially, all of these criminal networks that we're investigating, including human trafficking, are in it for profit. So one of our goals is to deprive those criminal organizations of those illicit proceeds. That's the way we think that we're really going to be able to disrupt and dismantle all of these organizations, human trafficking included. So as you can see, human trafficking. Just now? I just went. Did everybody hear what I said before? All right. Can I have that one?
I think the mics are on, but maybe they're not up.
How about that? Better?
Yeah, that's better.
All right. All right. You want me to start from the beginning? I'm just kidding. All right. So, human trafficking and human smuggling. All right, as I was trying to say, and hopefully some people heard me, that is a top priority for Homeland Security investigations. And we have it, we do, in some cases, we have them blocked together, because some of the agents that work human smuggling also work human trafficking, but they are 2 very separate and very distinct crimes. Human smuggling is a transportation-based crime. Essentially what it means is that somebody will contract with an organization to have them transported from point A through point B to point C, a source country, a transit country potentially, and then the destination country. You pay your money, you get transported. Now sometimes human smuggling does have a violent element to it. There could be hostage taking, there could be violence, there could be extortion involved, but it does not necessarily rise to the level of human trafficking. Human trafficking for the federal government kicks in an entirely different set of laws, and those are very powerful tools. Human trafficking, the federal government looks at it as human trafficking is an exploitation-based crime. And what I mean by that is that, and one of our best tools is the Trafficking and Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, and that tells us that it comes in 2 main categories. It's either commercial sex or forced labor, and in each case, the exploiters are intimidating their victims through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So for us to charge human trafficking, that's what you have to have in in every case but one. We need to have those elements: force, fraud, or coercion, except for when it's commercial sex involving a minor, an underage female. Then we can charge human trafficking and the human trafficking statutes on a federal level without having to prove force, fraud, or coercion. But in most of those cases, we're going to have them anyway. So that's the definition of the problem and the tools that we have to use for it. Now, a lot of times, people ask, okay, well, what is the scope of the problem? All right. Sometimes the statistics don't look that great, or they're not that impressive, and we know that it's a big problem, but we can't really scope it out. That's always been a problem for law enforcement, and human trafficking is no different. But one study that was done years ago by the U.S. State Department suggested that there were as many as 100 people, or 100 persons, every hour of every day get trafficked or become victims of human trafficking across the globe. So that's 800,000 people a year, and that is, that's just far too much. So what's Homeland Security trying to do about it? Well, we have a strategy. We call it ICE TIPS. It's Immigration Customs Enforcement Trafficking in Persons Strategy. It is also part of the DHS Blue Campaign. And what we're trying to do is includes coordination with both our other federal, our state and local law enforcement partners, non-government organizations like the ladies up here in the front, the advocates, and the general public as well. The strategy includes outreach to the victims, outreach to the witnesses, and other members of the public to raise awareness of the dangers of human trafficking. HSI is committed to the victim-centered approach. And what I mean by the victim-centered approach is that we place equal amount of effort and priority identifying and rescuing the victims as we do prosecuting and investigating the exploiters and the criminals who are exploiting those victims. So the same amount of effort goes into the two. We are very good at arresting, investigating, and prosecuting. But where we need help and where we're coming up short is identifying the victims that we can rescue. And that's why I'm here, to make sure that everybody understands what our goal is and where we can work together. Another thing I wanted to remind everybody, in case you didn't know, is not all victims are going to be U.S. citizens. Some victims are going to be foreign-born nationals. And not all of those foreign-born nationals are going to have immigration status, all right? That is another thing that we can help with. We have different ways to grant either stays or relief from deportation, and in some cases even temporary immigration status to victims of human trafficking. So keep that in mind when you're working with us. Oh, also, HSI has trained non-law enforcement victim witness coordinators, and they do an outstanding job. If I just put that away, can you hear this at all? All right, so our trained non-law enforcement victim witness coordinators are doing an outstanding job working with our agents, other federal agencies, and in the community to make sure that victims are getting the services and care that they deserve. So that's another resource that the federal government and my agency has to help with the victims. So it's another reason why I want you to kind of keep that in mind, that we do have the resources and the ability to take care of these victims if we can show that they really are victims of human trafficking. As I said before, human trafficking is often, a lot of times what we see is that it's an international crime, all right? And what we have it involves source, transit, destination, countries across the globe. We also see it, unfortunately, right here locally, and some of the stuff that I'm seeing most recently, and part of it is because those are the victim advocates who are coming forward. Those are the victims that are coming forward. We see in a lot of domestic commercial sex cases. We still have the ability to do those cases. We still want to work with you. And some of the ways that we're seeing that state and local law enforcement and sometimes other federal agents may first think that it's a pimp-prostitute relationship. isn't necessarily a pimp-prostitute relationship, and if there are minors involved or if it's force, fraud, or coercion, we're going to take those cases and present them for federal prosecution, and that's where we want to work with you on. So whether it's international or domestic cases, we want to work those cases together. So I guess the last thing that I would want to leave you with is the challenge, the main challenge that we have as law enforcement officers on the federal, state, and local level is getting victims and witnesses to come forward. And what we're seeing is that's going to be for two main reasons. One is they're afraid of their exploiter. Two, especially with foreign-born victims, they're afraid of law enforcement and don't want to get sent home. So that's where we really need the public and the victim advocates to understand the process, know what the resources are, and don't be afraid to come forward and work with us. And hopefully everybody got one of the handouts for HSI. You can report victims of human trafficking through our website. It's www.ice.gov, or contact one of our local offices, because as I hope I did a good enough job of explaining that this is a priority for us. We do have the resources. What we need is the ability to work together to have an impact on this crime. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to taking any questions.
Well, I would ask you to hold the questions. You can start writing your cards, though, until after all the panelists have had an opportunity to speak. Thank you so much, Special Agent Spiro.
Thank you.
And, you know, this is why one of the reasons why we're doing this program is to have a coordinated response. And, of course, the feds are very important in a coordinated response. And now I will turn it over to C.J. Boykin, who is going to tell us about human trafficking arrests and prosecutions statewide and regionally. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you can all hear me?
Oh, and by the way, speaking of that, for those of you up in the hinterlands back there, I know some of you, and you're not shy. I see. And don't worry, I won't call on you. So anybody who's having problems hearing, please come up front. It's a lot easier to hear, and that applies to ADA Ben Mastitis, Vincenzo, Sophia. Who else do I see? Lieutenant Barone. I see a whole bunch of people who are not usually shy. They can all come down. And by the way, he's doing a terrific job. Oh. So now, CJ?
Thank you. Okay, that was the Fed perspective. In each of your packets, at the very last insert on the left side, I think, is a human trafficking referral form. On the left side, the very last insert. Do you guys all have that? Okay, that's what begins the human trafficking confirmation process in New York State. Now, we've talked about the statistics pretty much most of the symposium. Yes, they're pretty bleak. There are small numbers upstate of prosecutions and much larger numbers downstate, and a lot of the reasons for that, of course, with the concentration of the population. But this confirmation process is totally separate from prosecutions. So what this requires is, it used to be up until January that only law enforcement could submit referrals for confirmation. But that changed in mid-January, so now all basically most legal/social services agencies can also submit referrals to OTDA and DCGS for a victim confirmation. Now, we talked about the problems of prosecutions, and that's what these stats go to, but the confirmation of victims are totally separate. So, when this form is submitted to us, all it requires is, under the statutes and regulations, is for the victim to reasonably appear to be a victim of human trafficking. So what does reasonably appear to be a victim of human trafficking mean? It's a very broad statement, or very broad standard. That standard is intentional because the New York State statute is a victim-centered statute that's looking to encompass as many victims as possible. So, despite the lack of prosecutions, you're not going to have a good prosecution without witnesses who are prepared to testify in court. So that's part of the goal of this procedure, is to have victims confirmed as victims of human trafficking. So what does that mean? Under the state law and under regulations, my technical title is the Director of Human Trafficking. Now, not that I'm directing human trafficking, but the Director of Human Trafficking for purposes of confirmation. So the regulations make my authority very broad. I can consider a lot of different things, and the list under the regulations isn't definitive. It's expansive. It says, in addition to other things, the victim's age, what's the crime considered, all these sorts of things. So under those regulations, my ultimate ability to determine someone as a victim of human trafficking is very broad. So now that law enforcement isn't the only entity that can do that, that's resulted in an increased number of referrals that we're getting. Initially, in 2007, when the law went into effect, the advocate's major complaint was, look, only law enforcement's getting to do this. That's going to be a problem. And that was an issue up until this year. So now it's very broadened, and many other entities can help decide who becomes a victim. So once that referral is submitted, and it doesn't take a lot under that referral, you can see it's a very small document that can be filled out very cursorily. Once that's submitted, I get it along with Nora Cronin of OTDA. The law requires me to consult the referral source, who is either the local law enforcement agency or a local advocacy agency. I consult that referral source and OTDA, and after discussing it amongst the three of us, I have the ultimate determination as to whether the person becomes a victim of human trafficking. There is an appeals process in case I should deny that confirmation status, but no one would ever appeal my decision because I'm always right. So that's pretty much how it works. And although law enforcement sometimes seems a little disturbed that other agencies other than law enforcement can make these referrals now, there's really no need for law enforcement to fret about this. Number one, like I mentioned earlier, you're not going to get good prosecution cases without good witnesses who are able to testify. Number two, although these witnesses don't want to participate today, they may tomorrow. So it takes all these things and a concerted effort to getting these victims the services they need. When Judge Camacho talked about the victim that he had in his court, you never heard about the prosecution. Now, I don't know if there was a prosecution that was corollary to that scenario that he discussed, but what he talked about was the services provided that victim and how she was able to become actualized, essentially. So confirmation is separate from prosecution, and that's my role when it comes to this whole law enforcement scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ. All right, I think we're getting a very good picture of the problem and some of the resources available. I'm going to turn now to our all-important local law enforcement, and I will start with you, District Attorney Soares.
I was really hoping you'd go down the line. But, how is everyone today? Thank you very much for being here. If I seem a little nervous, it's because I'm having a lot of flashbacks to the days where I was actually sitting right where you're sitting. And Professor Hutter would be shouting his presentation to us, and we would be sitting perfectly still, not even breathing, to make sure that we didn't do anything to trigger him calling out our name and answering any questions. So I've been working to try to steadily, but we're here for a very important topic, and one that's complicated, and I'm hoping that by the time I'm through here talking about one of our cases, our human trafficking cases, it will help shed light as to the reason why the numbers of prosecutions appear in your records to be so low. As another one of my famous professors, Professor Timon, rest his soul, used to say when we would ask him a question, searching desperately for an answer, he would say, "Sir, there are fewer things that are as dark and yet so full of subtle difficulties in responding to the particular subject matter." And I would apply that same description here. There are fewer things in this world and in my office that are as dark and complicated and so filled and charged with subtle difficulties. It's been talked about here already, and I think our judges had touched on this. Unlike most traditional cases which rely on, the ability of your law enforcement community to gather evidence and our ability to withstand a lot of the challenges that many of you in this audience will raise during motion practice, these cases stand or fall on the shoulders of our victims. We cannot make these cases unless we have our victims on board and participating with us all the way. And even when they do, there really are no assurances as to our success. I can say to you that we have probably more tools available to us to prosecute these cases, to find defendants, to bring some defendants to justice. We probably have more manpower associated with the pursuit of these cases. We probably have more technology today than we did 10 years ago in our effort to prosecute these cases. But these cases, and the most important thing that you need in these cases is one thing, and that is trust. Without trust, you have no case. I know we're supposed to be here to talk about practice, and we're also here to talk about ethics. But with these cases in particular, they succeed or they fail based upon the collective group of people here and the collective disciplines and the collective profession's ability to establish that important level of trust with that victim. And if you can't do it, then you don't have a case. So what I'd like to do now, if I can, is just share with you the case that we did prosecute successfully, and one of the most complicated cases that we've ever handled in my 3 terms as district attorney here in Albany County. It's the People v. John Hammond, a.k.a. Poopy. John Hammond started, with our particular victims when he came upon one of them as she was leaving the visiting area at the Rhode Island State Prison facility. She had been there to visit her former boyfriend, father of her child, and as she was coming out and heading to the bus, John Hammond seized upon this opportunity to give her a ride home, where he began to groom her. This young lady became one of his most trusted victims, and soon she rose to the top of, call it, his administration. Mr. Hammond had conducted business not only in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, but he also conducted a lot of business here in Albany, in the Capital District area, specifically targeting our most festive summer event, that being the racetrack in Saratoga. Our journey with Mr. Hammond begins in Colony. Let me just take a break here by saying one other thing. In order to begin that trust, in order to begin developing that trust, it really starts with the very first person who has contact with our victim. And what made this case possible for us to prosecute was the fact that that particular officer who had spotted the transaction, one of the transactions in the parking lot of that hotel, that particular officer set the perfect tone for the entire interaction with this group of people. But let me take you back to Connecticut, to New Hampshire. Mr. Hammond, this charming gentleman named Poopy, had been in a New Hampshire hotel with a young lady that he had doped up and was pimping her out. Mr. Hammond reached out to the young lady's sister and informed the young lady's sister that he was going to be hurting her if she didn't come up with the money that the young sister owed her. So let's take that back for a moment. I'll just use different names. So Amy is the current young lady that he's pimping, and he reaches out to Amy's sister Betty to inform Betty that Amy had a debt and that Betty needed to come and pay for that debt. Betty, in crisis, leaves her home in Rhode Island and comes to New Hampshire to see what's going on with the sister. Betty brings her child to that hotel at that point, and this gentleman, this charming gentleman, takes the two ladies, Amy and Betty, and leaves the child in the hotel, and then decides to come to Albany to engage in this market. Long story short, the officer in Colony, because Colony is a very commercial area, if you notice Central Avenue, there are a number of hotels. Those are the prime locations for these perpetrators to carry out their trade. This particular officer, who had been on patrol, stumbled upon one young lady doping up another, also assaulting. There was an assault in the car. He stumbles upon this, begins his investigation, and before you know it, everyone's arrested. We have the young lady who was engaged in prostitution in the hotel who was arrested, along with Mr. Hammond, along with the two associates that were in the car. Now, there are many who would think, well, why would you make an arrest? Why, we should have a very different philosophy when it comes to human trafficking, to which I would say, yes, I agree with that. However, in this particular instance, that arrest provided the moment of interruption that was so necessary in order for the victims' advocates and in order for law enforcement to really go about doing their business. It also provided a very unique situation in which defense attorneys who were assigned to defend the young ladies, it also provided one of the most unique circumstances where defense attorneys and prosecutors and victim advocates are all sitting at the same table having a conversation about how we go about addressing the issue at hand. I'm not going to take too much time, but just to identify a couple of concerns that were had here. It started, the successful prosecution of this case, as I said, started with the tone that was set by that police officer upon that initial interaction. We went at this for a long period of time with victim advocates from the office working very closely with the defense attorneys who were in turn communicating with their clients. The pimp, who happened to be in the same jail, was already delivering messages and notes to his victims in jail. We had to move our victims to a different county, a different jail, just to have the separation, the isolation to begin doing the work. As I said, the most important quality to have in these cases are trust. The other is the ability to listen even when they're shouting, because in the shouting they're articulating to you what their greatest needs and concerns are. I've never handled a case where I'm picking up the phone and calling CPS in another state, talking to the attorney in another state representing the particular victim in family court. We've never had a case where basically the office is managing every aspect of the victim's life in order to establish just the basic level of trust for them to cooperate in our ability, in our prosecution of John Hammond. The two gentlemen who just presented here, and I know that there were a lot that were said, these cases cannot be made unless you have a friend at Homeland Security. These cases cannot be made unless you have a friend at DCJS. These cases can't be made because most of the people that you are going to encounter have all of these collateral issues that to them is more pressing and more urgent than the fact that they're being victimized every single day, 20 times a day, every single day of their lives. And unless you have a phone number, a person to contact, to call, to address some of those issues, for example, the visa issues, and the qualifications and that process of qualifying people as victims, if you don't have leverage and if you don't have these people on your side working hand in hand with you, these cases are impossible to make. Not only are these cases impossible to make, even for providing services and for getting them to open up to you, to do what you have to do, if you don't have these people available to you, those cases are impossible. Your cases are impossible to handle as well. Lastly, I will say this. Over the last several years, this has been a hot topic. We've been discussing this. You're seeing PSAs. We are not doing nearly enough in terms of PSAs and public awareness. A few years ago, the governor did a great thing in this state. Governor Cuomo had a human trafficking program at the rest areas, putting posters with phone numbers at rest areas. That was a great step. But we certainly need to be able to provide that sort of information to the places and environments that we find this population engaged in, because we can't help them unless they know that there are people out there willing to help them. I say this because we also need to educate the public. We put this case on, it took about 3 weeks to prosecute this case, and we came back with a hung jury. And the reason we came back with a hung jury is because, you know what? When it's on television, when it's on Law and Order, when it's on Special Victims, it's usually a young lady who, could be doing a Dove commercial on one day, and she's playing a victim of a human trafficking victim the next day. But that's not the reality. The particular young ladies that we had that we were helping in this case, when they were testifying, and the things that came out of their mouths made me blush. Not an easy thing to do. And the jury, some of whom got it, but a lot of them who did not. Hung jury. But we had a strong enough case. We had a lot of evidence that forced a plea from this particular defendant. He's not the only person out there doing this. There are so many more people out there doing this. But in order for us to be able to hold people accountable, we have to get through the greatest barrier, and that barrier is trust. Thank you.
Thank you, DA Soares, and I want to comment on one of the many points that you made, and that is the people in my court, and one of them is here today, the ADAs, and my primary public defender is also here. They have to work as a team when it comes to these cases. They have to step back from their usual role, and I have encouraged them to do so in my court, and they have done so. They are trying to work together to achieve what we all want, which is justice for the victim. Thank you for raising that issue. That is part of what we're trying to do here today, all work together as a team. Thank you. Chief Cox.
Thank you, Judge, and thank you for inviting me here today. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? I think you can all hear me because I think I hear the echo, so that's good. So, like the district attorney, I spent a lot of hours in this building. It was not to learn, it was to break in and play basketball in the winter when I was a kid. So as long as nobody arrests me, it's all good to go, but I certainly wasn't in this room, but I was in the gym a lot. So I'm going to start off by getting myself in trouble, and that's okay. What the district attorney just talked about, building trust, we have to do, and I think we're recognizing that more and more, and I say we, the police. If the Albany Police Department, if you ever read the headlines that the Albany Police Department has arrested a 12-year-old for prostitution, I'm going to expect that all of you join my wife and my sisters down at City Hall demanding that I be fired. And I don't say that to criticize my colleague from wherever that was that occurred. But that's part of our problem, is that we have to understand, and this isn't just the police now, this is the entire state, that we have to treat our kids like kids. And that if we have a 12-year-old who's prostituting, she's not doing that because she wants to do that, she's doing that because she's a victim. And from the moment that we have contact with her, we need to make sure that we treat her like a victim. Some of the things that Judge Ackerman brought up before was also with ages. We're all over the place in this state with ages. And while I recognize that some 16 and 17-year-olds need to be treated like adults, the majority of them do not need to be treated like adults. But we put this in the mindset of folks that 16 and 17-year-old, and even 12 if they're out there prostituting themselves, that's their problem, not my problem. David was talking about folks' expectations, and they do. People expect that what they see on TV is a victim, and as soon as that's not the person that they see, then it doesn't matter. They can just throw that person away. So we need to all stand together and make sure that we change the way that we do things in this state, because it is pathetic to hear those stories, and it's pathetic to find out that we arrest a 12-year-old for prostitution. And I don't think a 12-year-old's culpable to actually commit prostitution, not just in the Family Court Act, but overall. So in the Albany Police Department, some of the things we're trying to do, and thankfully I have a great partner sitting next to me, is we're trying to look at when somebody's committing a crime, find out what's driving that crime and how we stop that and how we help that person. So one of the things that we did is a few years ago, we looked at our prostitution issues, specifically along the Central Avenue corridor. We were getting a lot of complaints, we were having a lot of issues, we had a lot of business owners that were saying, hey, enough is enough, we got to do something. So we sat down with our community response unit, which is the investigative unit that oversees a prostitution case, and basically got back from the detectives like, hey, we don't want to arrest prostitutes. Not for a good night. Same things happen over and over again. They wind up coming in and out of court. We wind up with bench warrants and having to treat them over and over again, and we just wind up having more and more arrests, and nothing changes in the end. So we said, okay, let's try something. Let's see if we, what is driving it? And as we looked at the number of individuals that had been arrested for prostitution, men and women, we recognized there were really three prevailing things. There were folks suffering from addiction, folks suffering from mental illness, and folks that were domestic violence victims. So we said, why don't we do this? Why don't we get everybody together, and why don't we see if we can do some outreach? And why don't we see if we can not arrest them? So we tried that. And the first time we did that, I'm not going to tell you we were successful, because we weren't. Because as we sat down with all of our partners, there was nothing really holding us all together. And when I say partners, I include victim services at this point. There was nothing holding us all together. Nobody had ownership of anything. And ultimately, when we said, hey, we need to meet at 2 o'clock, when people said, okay, I'll see you after lunch, and we said, no, we mean 2 o'clock in the morning, that's when we have this. And we got back from some people, good friends of mine, that, well, sorry, we're closed, we don't have anybody working. I said, well, I don't have the ability to close. We have to be open 24 hours a day, and we need to address this. So we failed that time. And then we were given an opportunity to really pull that failure up and succeed. So we've been able to implement the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program. And that gets mentioned a lot when we talk about drugs, but we were able to widen the scope of that and recognize that we look at crimes that are driven by ultimately mental illness, drug addiction, victims of domestic violence, poverty, to look at those issues and to try to make sure that when we have contact with folks that, yeah, by the penal law, they're breaking a law, but in reality, in order for us to make the public safe and actually help that person out, we can do different things. So it's my hope that we stop, at least in the city of Albany, arresting prostitutes. Now, just like the district attorney said, there's some times where it's, hey, there's no other choice at this moment, and if we're actually going to get this person out of this life, we may need to do that. So we all recognize that we might need to do that. But we have to also recognize that we have to do things a little bit differently. And we have to start making sure that we're taking care of those folks, because that's what's happening. So there's a couple other things going on that are good. We have a partnership hopefully coming up with Equinox and In Our Own Voices, where we're going to help and go do some street outreach. We had just done that not that long ago. Because although we don't see the cases coming across with the human trafficking charges, what we know is that we do have that issue. We have that issue specifically with our runaways. We have a number of group homes in this city, and we know that the young men and women that run away from those facilities become victims over and over again. A lot of them are already victims before they were put in that home. And we also know that from an immigration standpoint that we have an issue. We've had a couple of cases come to us where somebody has been trafficked into our area and victimized over, where we aren't able to break through those barriers. We do the best we can to try to help them out. We do sign a lot of the U-Visa paperwork to let folks know that, hey, this person was a victim, they need to be able to stay here. But we recognize that it's very difficult for us to break that barrier. So if we can start changing the way we do things as a whole in society, I think we could start maybe building that trust and helping those folks out, because we're not doing any good by just arresting them.
Thank you, Chief Cox. And I do recognize that it is very difficult for law enforcement. It's a very delicate balance. Chief Cox doesn't want to arrest prostitutes, yet he is under some pressure, and I know this because I go to the community meetings, and I know that there are quality of life issues in the community. People don't want to walk down the streets and be accosted. I can remember my own dad. We were in New York City visiting my mother in the hospital. He was, I don't know, my dad passed away at the age of 101, and we were in New York City coming back from a hospital visit of my mom, and he was, I don't know, maybe 96 at the time, and I had to step into a convenience store to pick up something, so there was a bench outside, so I said, Dad, just wait for me out here, and I came back out, and sitting next to him was a prostitute, and he was very flattered by the attention. I think he was rather enjoying it, but 96 years old. Anyway, you know, there are quality of life issues, and I know that it is difficult for law enforcement. People don't want to encounter this every day on the streets, and yet we have to be sensitive here. So we should understand what law enforcement is dealing with. So thank you to all of our panelists, and now it's time for us to hear from all of you. Questions? Okay.
Might have just said it on here.
Oh. The New York State localities intentions. Please discuss New York State localities' intentions and/or practice of going after the consumer, the John.
Yeah. Well, in Albany County, we've made that a primary focus of our interdiction efforts with respect to human trafficking, because you got to have a deterrence for the Johns. And traditionally, what's happened is they show up embarrassed on that day, and they plea out to a disposition of a discon that you'd otherwise never know what they were originally charged with. In Albany County, we make it a point to have them plead to the loitering charge, and we also have created a particular page that I'm pretty proud of on our website that's called the Front Page. And what they do is they go and troll the back page to pick up and to make these dates, and we want people to understand that if you do this and you get prosecuted here, you're going to appear on the front page on our website. So you can go on my particular website and the Albany County DA's office and see the individuals who are now making the front pages for prostitution.
Thank you. I love it. Yes, shaming will very much cut down on the demand, which will, of course, cut down on the supply, and that's what we want. Now, what percentage of underage victims are boys? I don't know. We just, CJ's the one with the stats. Do you happen to know what percentage of underage victims are boys?
No, I don't, but I think Nora Cronin of OTDA might know that better.
Well, when we get to the victim panel, I will address that question. Thank you. All right, we do need to move on. I think we're running a little tight on time at this point. So Thank you all. We'll play musical chairs.
Anybody heard anything?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, David. See, you can dance outside. All right.
Prepared to give it to her. She needs it.
Yeah, there's room. I think we can pull up another chair. That way I won't have to get whiplash looking back and forth.
Come on in. Thank you. It's better this way.
And we have heard a lot this afternoon about the nature of the problem and the legal remedies. Now let's focus on the victims and how and whether they can be made whole. So, Nora, I think we'll start with you as the state official responsible for responding from a service perspective to the needs of human trafficking victims. What can we do to help them?
Thank you so much, Your Honor. Continuing legal education, agency law. The OTDA, the anagram you may have heard, stands for the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. And that is the agency that employs me. And together with DCJS, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, we oversee the services that are provided to victims of human trafficking here in New York State. So to be clear, DA Soares indicated that if you are going to successfully prosecute or work with human trafficking victims, you need a lot of friends. And I'm here to give you some ways to get help for victims that you may encounter through your work, whether you're a prosecutor, a defense attorney, or somebody who works with victims as a social service agency in your daily practice. As CJ mentioned, in 2007, the referral process was created and open to law enforcement to refer victims of human trafficking. In 2015, the governor signed as part of the Women's Equality Act a change in the law that allowed established social and legal service providers the opportunity to refer victims as well. We can only help victims that are identified to us. So it's very important that if you encounter somebody that you reasonably believe to be a victim of human trafficking, to identify them as soon as possible, because we need to be able to get them services so that they can be stabilized and work with their community members to leave a life of trafficking. And to be clear, the trafficking victims that you'll encounter are young people, especially runaway and homeless youth, folks who are LGBTQ identified. They're minority populations. As the judges indicated on their panel, these are folks with criminal histories, and they're undocumented persons. So you'll be working with some of the most vulnerable populations in our state. And a lot of times our victims do not understand that they are entitled to benefits under our law that local social service districts can provide for them. And if they are an undocumented person, we have 6 state providers that provide services through OTDA's Response to Human Trafficking program. And I'm going to call them out because I think that if you are looking for resources, that they would be able to assist you, even if you're working with a victim who is not an undocumented person. And there are many such excellent providers throughout the state. These 6 just happen to be the ones that receive state funding through our grant. Here in the Capital Region, the Worker Justice Center is located in Kingston. They also have offices in Rochester. In Westchester, my sister's place provides excellent service, and they also work with the Westchester Task Force that identifies victims in Westchester. In New York City, we have 2 providers, Urban Justice Center and the Sanctuary for Families. In Buffalo, in Western New York, the International Institute of Buffalo provides services. And finally, out on Long Island, Catholic Charities, which is based in Amityville, provides services. And if you may have heard of these organizations before, they have a background in many different types of work. So whether the person is a victim of sex or labor trafficking, they will be able to provide services to victims in the best possible way. Some of the services that our victims need range from basic medical care to housing is a very big concern. Women are often in need of OBGYN care. We've seen a lot of people request dental care, immigration services through legal assistance, and of course, case management, basic therapeutic services that you would expect to have, you would expect a person who has been through the trauma that a victim of human trafficking would need. So, in conclusion, the good news is that the state is here to help. If you have any questions, please reach out to myself or to any of the panelists today. We are not going to be able to do this alone, but I know that with everyone's assistance, we can really make a difference, and we already have. So thank you very much all for listening and attending.
Thank you, Nora. And now I'm going to turn to Joanne Macri of the Office of Indigent Legal Services and a valued member, I should add, of the Gender Fairness Committee.
Oh, thank you, Ron. You're way too kind. I want to thank you all for spending the afternoon with us today, particularly dealing with a tough topic like human trafficking. I come to this topic basically as someone who works very closely with the defender community through our office, New York State Office of Indigent Legal Services. We not only provide some support to attorneys who are assigned to represent individuals in criminal proceedings, but we also provide support to those individuals who are parents or involved in family court proceedings. Because as you probably can imagine, human trafficking does not take on, as we already know throughout the day, a particular type of victim, whether that individual is a U.S. citizen or not a U.S. citizen, their age, their race, their sexual orientation. All of those characteristics go out the window when we're dealing with the issue of human trafficking. And particularly, we know from our experiences that these individual victims may sometimes come up because they have somehow hit the point of crisis, right? They've either been arrested, and we've had individuals involved in theft cases, possession of drugs, maybe sale of drugs involving their trafficker, for instance, where they are working for the trafficker, not just for the purpose of sex crimes, but maybe for selling drugs on behalf of their trafficker. We've seen individuals who are involved in guardianship proceedings, PINS proceedings, abuse and neglect proceedings, where the individuals who might be trafficking them may be family members. So as a result of that, we realize, and I think what I'm really thrilled about today, this afternoon, I just feel so energized, is this idea that we all understand that we need to break the barriers on how we're dealing with human trafficking. We can't deal with it in a traditional sense. We need to be able to provide sort of a collaborative response to this problem, right? Not one group should be the only group that's responsible for addressing the issue. We know that the courts are involved. We know that the prosecution and law enforcement are involved. We know that we have victim services. We know that we need community-based organizations to be involved and members of the community to be educated. And I'm also here to say that we know that those individual defenders that walk into a courtroom have to be responsible for identifying those individuals who may be seen as victims of trafficking. And we will see them, and we do see them. And what we're trying to do now is sort of to establish a protocol that not only do these victims get identified by allowing our attorneys to work with social workers more closely as well as with other types of victim advocate services, but also to make sure that when they do recognize a victim who may be arrested, who may be facing a bail of $5,000 or $10,000 for a particular crime, that they will then advocate and work with the prosecution to convince the prosecution and the court that there should be some type of alternative because of the fact that they are victims of trafficking. I mean, this is something that time and time again we need to battle. And I think we're on the right path, especially having heard everyone today. The last thing I just want to wrap up with is we do have a lot of individuals that are victims of human trafficking who are not U.S. citizens. Now, I can assure you that when it comes to our defender community, across the board for all criminal defense attorneys, especially under a recent Supreme Court decision, United States versus Padilla versus Kentucky, where the United States Supreme Court held that every defense attorney must ask about the immigration status of their client in a criminal proceeding, especially if that individual is going to take a plea of guilty before the person decides to plead guilty, that we have our defenders looking at the immigration status of their clients. Why? so that those individuals can be advised of immigration consequences as well as benefits. And this is particularly important for those individuals who may be picked up on trafficking cases, arrested in massage parlors, for example, or prostitution streetwise. Those individuals will be able to have access to the potential to apply for particular types of visas that will allow them to possibly remain in the United States. And I mentioned too, there's a chart that has some detailed information for you in the materials, the T and the U visas. These are federal authorized visas from the United States Department of Homeland Security through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. The T visa is available to victims of severe trafficking. And again, the chart will give you more details. We don't have enough time for that today, but I want to say those visas are available to allow people who don't have status in the United States to be able to remain temporarily for up to a period of 4 years, and also allows them for the potential to obtain immigration status in the future. We also have something called the U visa, which is a visa for victims of crime, and there are 29 crimes that are specified in that category, including victims of human trafficking. And if you're a victim of crime and you're here undocumented, that visa will allow you to be here temporarily with the possible opportunity in the future to gain status. Why do I say that's so important? These are the individuals who become the great witnesses when we need to prosecute the traffickers. And that's something that we continue to try to educate the public on. Having said that, we do have a regional immigration assistance center. We have 6 of them across the state. We're asking for any family members who have individuals involved in family or criminal court proceedings. If there's an immigration issue, contact one of our regional service centers. If you need their information, please don't hesitate to contact the New York State Office of Immigration Legal Services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And thank you for raising some of the professional and ethical issues that defense attorneys need to think about when they represent people, possibly foreign-born people. So, Professor Breaker, last but definitely not least, and Melissa is an expert in the field of human trafficking, and an abstract of her paper on the healing of sex-trafficked children is among your materials, and I encourage you to read it. Melissa.
Thank you, Judge. As the final speaker for today's terrific and informative program, and also as one of your hosts from Albany Law School, I feel compelled to end our program on a happy note. Unfortunately, as we all know with this topic, that is quite a challenge, but I'm going to try. But first, let me add some more depressing and tragic statistics and facts to our discussion. As James Sparrow outlined some of the scope of the epidemic globally, some researchers have estimated that every minute, 2 children are sexually enslaved across this globe. That's the scope. As you have heard from Judge Camacho, the child or the victim is typically relocated to new cities, new states, in order to prevent detection, avoid prosecution, prevent escape, because certainly if you're in a new city, you might not be wanting to escape, and also to provide fresh faces to the customers. The human trafficking industry generates over $32 billion in profits each year, and I suspect it's much more than that if we count the traffickers that we have not yet caught. What is critical for folks to remember, and many of you know it, many of the victim services folks have been dealing with this all along, is that trafficking victims are highly likely to sustain a chronic, lifelong, post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, PTSD. It's what we see in our war veterans, our combat war veterans, we see in our trafficking victims. The psychological and the physical trauma that's endured by these victims is intense, long-lasting. The victims are repeatedly traumatized over time. As you heard from District Attorney Soros, a trafficked victim may be sold 10, 20, 30 times a day, day after day. This is why it is more lucrative than even selling weapons or drugs, because there it's a one-time sale. You sell your drug, you sell your weapon, that's it. With a human being, you can sell them over and over again. Judge Ackerman touched upon the ideas of the range of symptoms that these victims have. I'll just name a few, by no means limiting. Intrusive re-experiencing of trauma, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, inability to sleep, disassociation, depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, drug addiction, self-mutilation, and of course, suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, even after rescue. Medically, health issues that have been discussed: sexually transmitted diseases, exhaustion, unwanted pregnancy, addictions, miscarriages, and bodily injuries from their traffickers, whether it be broken bones and teeth or the intentional branding and scarring of faces. Judge Camacho was right when he talked about those dead eyes of the victim. These victims are lost. So when you ask the next question, why don't they just leave? I ask you to think about what we've learned about today. I remind us how complicated this is. This is hardly a choice, and I applaud those in the judiciary and those in law enforcement who are beginning to see that more and more. We've come a long way in understanding why we don't ask about domestic violence victims. Why doesn't she just leave? The same thing is here. It is complicated. It is not only near impossible for these victims to leave their traffickers, just because these are very sophisticated, highly funded networks oftentimes, and very powerful people. They're afraid of them, of course. But it's also not uncommon to have what we call trauma-coerced bonding, where the victim actually bonds to the trafficker over time. And that's what complicates things, and that's what makes prosecutions of these cases difficult, because the victim often does not either identify as a victim or want to become identified as a victim. It's similar to the idea of Stockholm Syndrome that you've heard of. Remember, as we've heard today, we saw it on the video in the beginning of the lectures, oftentimes what's going on in the homes is causing these children to run away or be thrown away, whether it's child abuse, sexual abuse at home, whether it's neglect, whether it's no notion of parental unconditional love, whatever it is, they find this love often from their traffickers, ironically so. And then it becomes very complicated to extricate these folks from their traffickers, as you heard. And, you know, these traffickers are genius. Right? They're genius. They're not unlike, let's say, child sexual abusers and domestic violence perpetrators. They know how to isolate the victim. They know how to break down barriers. They know how to play on a victim's insecurities. They can manipulate. And they're doing all of this while they're beating and raping these victims, right? So that they maintain their power and control over the victim while still letting these victims believe that this is something that they want to do. As I've mentioned before in other contexts, sometimes for children who have run away from family homes or been thrown away, their exploiters are often providing the level of structure that they are not finding at home. So it's just truly ironic that as they run away from an abusive situation, they find themselves within 24 to 48 hours often in the hands of another exploiter. So I know we're on a quick time frame. I want to try to go back to the happy point. It's not much, but we have raised today some awareness, and many of you in the audience, if not all of you in the audience, already knew about this epidemic, and that's why you're here. But this is also being webcast through OCA to all the judges, and there are others that are watching it remotely. And so just having this conversation is starting the dialogue. And just having this coordinated community response between judges and defense attorneys and prosecutors and victim advocates and law enforcement and I probably forgot a couple, politicians, policymakers, by having that response, we could attack this from many different angles. And again, hopefully, this conference is the start of that dialogue, and you'll all feel motivated to go out there and try to do the things that or kind of reach out with some of the things that we learned about today. We also need to change the culture of why it's okay for one person to sell another person, but that's another issue. So that's my only happy news I can give you. That's my glimmer of hope that this is the start of a dialogue. Before the judge takes some questions and answers, I do want to just thank our funders from the New York State Bar Association and Capital District Women's Bar Association who provided the food for you. Thank you also to the Third Department Gender Fairness Committee, where Judge Tretzer is the chair. Thank you to our dean, and I want to turn it back over to you for questions.
Well, thank you all so much, and we have reached that bewitching hour of 5 o'clock, but if there are any questions, I will try to entertain them quickly.
I can answer CJ's question.
Okay, Nora, if you can talk about the boys.
Sure. I did want to address the issue of male victims of trafficking, because I think that this just goes back to what DA Soares and many of the other panelists said. I can say that probably less than a quarter of those that we've identified through the New York confirmation process are men or boys, but that goes back to sort of opening your eyes to what a trafficking victim looks like. It's not always going to be the woman who's in a Dove commercial or an actress who was cast in Taken as the victim. So, you know, I would encourage those who are involved in investigations to ask more questions, especially of the men they may encounter, because not only are men sometimes dealing with not only is it more difficult for them to come forward because of our culture, but also because they may not see themselves as victims to begin with. So continue to keep up the good work with men. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Joanne, the next question, and it's really combined with the other question that I have, so I'll combine it. What incentive or benefits are available to an individual who is issued a T or U visa? And a follow-up to that is, individuals have a right to a lawyer when they're applying for a visa?
I know we're reaching the 5 o'clock, so I'll make it very brief. And I mentioned that, again, we have this handout in your materials that sort of provides all the criteria for the U and T visas. I also included, by the way, the S visa, which I know DHS is not going to like this, but we call it the snitch visa. Okay. Well, look, the reason I include it is for one main reason, and that is that do not be surprised that in some instances, those individuals who might be engaged in trafficking or recruiting for the traffickers have also been victims of trafficking themselves. And so as a result of that, in some instances, we believe that they might become actual informants to go up the chain of ladder, because oftentimes many of these situations involve organized parties that might be engaged in a large trafficker ring. But having said that, I will go back to the question, which is the U and T visa basically allow for individuals the opportunity to apply for what we call lawful permanent resident status, which is a green card. It's something that after a few years that can be a consideration that would go to the Department of Homeland Security for consideration to process such an application. However, there is no necessary right to entitlement of counsel to prepare these applications. We're very blessed here in New York State to have many, many nonprofit organizations who are willing to assist, including some of the organizations, many of the organizations that have been supported by the Office of Temporary Disability Advocates Services. So I would say that there are services available, but there is no right to counsel in those instances.
All right, thank you very much, Joanne. There were a couple of other questions, but I do like to stick to our time schedule as far as we can. And I just want to say, wow, what an impressive panel this has been, and what fabulous speakers we have had. So first, let me ask you all, stand and receive a round of applause. Now, I hope this program was as enlightening and as troubling for all of you as it is for me, and I hope that it leaves you with a sense of empowerment, energy to go out and do something. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.